Good evening. Okay. Well, where we are tonight in Exodus, we get to the Ten Commandments. So we'll kind of make this its own study all by itself, because it gets to chapter 21, gets a little complicated. So what I don't want to do is get through chapter 20, assuming I would anyway, and then have to try to hurry and just pick right back up. It'll be in 2 weeks, because next week's Father's Day, and apparently my family has all kinds of really wonderful things planned for me. So I'm just assuming. They haven't told me that, so I'm just... Make sure you tell them that, by the way. So I'm expecting stuff. Anyway, all kidding aside. Since next week we won't be here, I want to be able to deal with it all on its own. Because if you look at chapter 21, now these are the judgments that you will set before them if a servant. So we get into this whole thing of slavery is something that we get thrown in our faces as Christians often because of, yes, are you having trouble hearing back there? Oh, we're in Exodus chapter 20. So I'll set that up in just a moment. But my reason for being careful not to go past chapter 20 is because, boy, you get through that first verse of chapter 21, and it's a controversial thing that doesn't need to be. It's just because, people read things in English, and, it's a complex topic, but it's understandable. So we want to take our time with it and not have it be something where we're really kind of struggling with our understanding of it. So, chapter 20, there is one thing that becomes so obvious when you read this, and I wrote myself a little post-it note here because I wanted to make reference to it. When we read this, I want to be able to say I am so thankful for the grace of God, because to the Christian, we never want to take lightly how wonderful and how holy and how perfect God is. There's no question about that. But when you begin to read these things, you realize just how perfect He is and what He expects. And there's a good and a bad to that. Well, I shouldn't say bad. There is a real benefit to grace, but sometimes it really blinds us to how holy and how perfect He really is. And so the people who would have had to live in this time under this, what are very strict laws, doesn't make God a bad person. What it does is it gives people such narrowly defined, parameters of what is and what is not acceptable, and they had to live according to those things. And sometimes we miss that because we're not, quote, under the law. But when I see people rebelling against the Ten Commandments, as we go through them, oftentimes we'll hear that, oh, the Ten Commandments, we want them taken off of the public things, and we don't want to be noticing them or anything else. And about half of them, everybody that ever has an objection agrees with them. And you know what I mean by that? Because when you read them, it's like, okay, so I love asking this question. So you hate the Ten Commandments. So what part of you shall not murder or be an adulterer or a liar, or do you agree with those things? Just because you don't like the idea that there's a God who exists. So all of that to say before we start, and then to preface this, as we study through these things, these are the first of, if you will, the elements of the law, things that God says you will do this, you will not do that. You get an understanding almost immediately at how pure and holy and wonderful He is. And it can be somewhat blinding to us, especially if all we ever do is spend our time in New Testament and never realize that the same God who began this whole thing of giving these people the law is the same one that we serve today. God has not changed, not a bit. We are the beneficiaries of Jesus in His perfection, paying the price for our imperfection. And because of that, sometimes we forget how majestic and holy and perfect our God is. This is good reminder stuff. So, chapter 20, verse 1, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank You so much for gathering us in this place tonight. And as we come before You, we recognize that our times in which we live and all of the distractions can sometimes take our focus off Your holiness and Your perfection, Your love and Your grace, and all of those things that we really sometimes can maybe take for granted. They are given to us as a gift from a God who loves. Help us to recognize tonight the depths of your holiness and how serious you are about these matters. So we thank you, we give to you this evening, and pray that you would find in us people who are willing to hear your word, but not just be hearers, but also people who would approach you and recognize your holiness and who you are and what you represent to us. So, Father, we thank you again and pray that you would be glorified in us. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So as you look at chapter 20 at verse 1, you only need the first 3 words to recognize something again that is something so common to us, but yet every once in a while it's a good idea to be reminded of it. And God spoke. Now, of all of the gods that man has ever worshipped, quote unquote, or believed, this is the only God, the one in the Bible, who genuinely directly communicates with his creation. And he does it repeatedly through a variety of sources. Now, the closest that you'll get of the beliefs of man would be Islam. And yet, all of the communication allegedly that happened from God came through one man and one man only in 2 different revelations. But think about how many people God communicated with directly that wrote what they wrote, let alone the ones that we know that he communicated with directly that didn't write anything. We just have their stories. So God has done it repeatedly for so long that we have account of that God would communicate with specifics even better. He's been so careful to tell us with detail the things that are expected and why. The things that he will do in advance, what we looked at this morning, Zephaniah. I'm going to do this, 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 and this, and here's the reasons why. He tells you all such things. So his communication is not that just he speaks, but he speaks with specifics, and there's really, by the end of it all, there's no one that's going to go ahead and say, well, if only he had told us or given us some detail. Sometimes we get more detail than we probably want, right? Because it's always pointing the finger at us. We find out that we're the ones with the problem. Well, in this case, God begins by giving them what we would call the 10 Commandments. Some of them he has no commentary. Other ones he explains with some detail. So as we see in verse 1 of chapter 20, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. So this helps us to recognize precisely who is being spoken to here. Now, of course, we can make application, but let's deal with this first part of just straightforward the text. We know that these are the people that left in the Exodus, but it also helps us to recognize that they are also the children of Abraham, because that was the Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to Jacob's sons were the ones that spent their time in Egypt. And their generations after those 400 plus years made their way out of Egypt, and now they are on their way to the promised land. They're going to have a 40-year detour. That's, we'll get to that in time. But he begins by saying, let me give you instruction. This is what I want, and to you, you are the people who I have led out of the land of Egypt. Now, if we want to be able to look at this and say, great, we understand the history, we also want to understand who he is by nature. And here's why. As we look at this, we also need to recognize that to the believer, we have been removed from our bondage, sin. He's broken us from the chains and the servitude that we have to sin, and he's brought us into the newness of life. So, yeah, we can make application to that as well. And many of these things here, whether you realize it or not, you do these things naturally because you know that they would be pleasing to him. Other things we struggle with because they're just part of our nature. So, like, anybody murdered lately? Physically? Probably not. Maybe driving on your way here. You had murder in your heart, perhaps. Okay. Fortunately, I live close enough I could almost walk here. But if I was on the freeways, I'd be a murderer every day. Not literally, but I know I get frustrated with that. I'm just being, I'm being a little facetious. But you'll notice in each of these things, there is a straightforward call to you will do this or you will not do that. But it all begins with God saying, I'm holy and I call you to be likewise. So you will, the first of all of the ones that he talks about is you'll have no idols. Why does he begin with that one? Well, let's take a look at it where he says in verse 3, you will have no other gods before me. Now, some people see the word before and say, okay, so long as he's the first in the order of priority, then the rest of it is okay. It's not what it said. That's just, again, the problem that we have with English, because you'll find throughout, after this time, I won't share my place with anyone else. And the reason for that, we know what happens when you have divided allegiances, right? You can say that you're committed to him above all others, but if you're committed to any others in any way, you're divided in your allegiance. And eventually, you will water down his place of priority. So the believer shouldn't really struggle much with this, to think, well, I believe in the Lord above all things, but I have room for these other things. He says there's no room for those other things. So you will have none beside me. He puts that, I personally believe, in the first of all of it, because if that was in place, then the rest of them would fall in line. You would be able to do the rest because he would be your absolute priority, making way for the rest of these things. You're open to his instruction. Remember, if you were here this morning, what did we look at? There were the 4 problems that the people did that I believe caused the problem. It's found in the book of Zephaniah. If you weren't here this morning, it is that they did those 4 things. They didn't present themselves before the Lord, and because of that, they didn't trust anything that he would have to say, so they would not take his correction, nor were they obedient to him as a result. So if you're having gods before him and you have that divided allegiance, you're going to start to fall into these other things. So the first one that he says, you will have no other gods before me. If that was the case, then you wouldn't even need to look at verse 4, because this is what happens when you have other gods beside him. You will not make for yourself a carved image, the second of the 10. That means you're not going to fashion with your hands, and he'll explain further on this. In fact, the things that you see here are going to really carry through the rest of the laws that we will be studying in the chapters and even the books that follow this. They have their underpinnings in these 10 commandments. He elaborates on them by putting in a very intricate structure of you will do this, but you won't do that. So we see the second one, you will not make a carved image for yourself, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Now, the first part of that is, this is what they have seen, whether it's Egypt or even in the times of the idolatry that they had in the land before they even went to Egypt. This is man's way of doing things. We're pretty dense about this. We'll worship just about anything, right? Right? Yeah, so we demonstrate this through the ages. Even in our modern days, sometimes the idols are not the same. There are other things. Here's the best way to know what an idol is. It's the things that you pledge your allegiance to. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be a little figurine, fill in the blank. You can see a lot of things that we will give ourselves over to. But in this case, in particular, he deals specifically with the idolatry part of it. Now, he says, here you will also not do this. You will not bow down to them, nor will you serve them. Now, why is that? Because he says, for I, the Lord your God, am jealous, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who love me. Remember, we read that. It's very similar to what you read in Exodus 34. So 14 chapters later, we will read a very similar thing where God starts to give his characteristics. Jealousy, as we think of it, is not the jealousy that's being spoken of here, because God doesn't have that fickle emotional response to things like we do. So don't think jealousy like we think in the high school way. Right? Because now that we're out of high school, we don't think those ways anymore, right? But when you were in high school, you were a jealous person. He's not the same way. The point is, I'm not going to have you put me in the place with others. I won't have a rival, if you will. He's already covered that at the beginning of this. You'll have no other gods. Now, you won't fashion them in such a way as to bow down to them or to serve them. Now, this is an interesting thing even in the church, because there are people who will still at this point in churches bow to idols and petition and pray to them. Not only that, but there are entire orders that will serve groups or saints or even Mary herself. They will devote themselves to her service. Well, right here, it's an interesting thing. God says there's a total prohibition on that. An entire prohibition on any such practice. So, verse 6, he says after these here again, let's look at his attributes. I, the Lord your God, am jealous, and I will visit the iniquity on the fathers and the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Again, we keep using the example. Look at the children that were born in the captivity of Babylon for generations. They were not the sinners. Their parents were the ones who had fallen into that place. The children born to them were not responsible for why they were there in the first place, but their parents' disobedience to the Lord is what caused them to be born in captivity. So here's a great indication of it. Here's what he says by contrast in verse 6, showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, the seventh, or in verse 7, it's the third of the commandments, and notice these these are our obligation towards him. We'll have no other gods. We won't make images nor bow down or serve other gods in the likeness of whatever. The third of these is that you will not take the name of your Lord in vain, and that just simply means to make it empty or worthless. Now, that doesn't mean just profanity, like we hear thrown around so often by people. It's anytime that you're attaching something to God's name that's empty. God is my witness. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. But you don't even think about whether or not you're going to make good on that. If you bring him into the equation and into whatever it is that you're talking about, and it's just idle or empty words, that's also covered in this. So if you're going to employ his name, be very, very careful. So he says, you won't do these things in this empty or worthless way. You will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Why? Because, or for, the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So there's a consequence to it as well. You'll be held accountable for that. So he goes on to the next of them in verse 8, and then there is this matter of remembering the Sabbath day and then keeping it holy. So to be holy is sacred or set apart. Now this is, again, even in the modern church, this is controversial. Did you know that? When do you guys get together for church? Sundays. Oh, well, you're supposed to be meeting on Saturdays. Really? Why? And they'll point to this. Here's the issue with that, and where even Jesus addresses the whole thing. The Sabbath is not as big of an issue of what day it actually is. To them it was. To us today it's a different kind of a thing, because it's a matter of, notice, the Sabbath, the issue of it was to keep it holy, pure, sanctified, set apart. It was supposed to focus the people's mind and attention on the Lord only. You rest from all of your labors. You do absolutely nothing else but consecrate yourself to him. It's keeping it separate from the rest. That was the issue. So, again, why the church meets on Sunday, there's all kinds of the historical reasons. The early church did. It was the day of resurrection. But it's incidental. Here's what I would ask. Any churches that, even those ones who keep to this and they do this on Saturday, do they do it as a religious observance, or is there a real day of consecration to it? That's a good question. When we were in Israel, we know a lot of people take that day and they do all of it that are completely secular. So what does the Sabbath do for them? It's not a day of consecration to the Lord. It's a day that they observe because it becomes a religious observance. So we have it in the church as well. All kinds of religious observances that, okay, great, you do them because you're supposed to, but where's your heart in the matter? It becomes the much larger issue. And notice he goes in to explain this in some detail. Why would God want a day of consecration, of setting? He's already put it in place. This is also a very good argument, if you want one, for those people that would say the days of creation weren't a literal 24-hour period. They could have meant vast amounts of time to try to take into account that, we got to explain away the dinosaurs some way. Well, here you have, he says, 6 days you will labor, and you will do all of your work. However, on the seventh day, it is your Sabbath of the Lord your God, directed towards him. It is paying attention, and it is to recognize who he is. You rest from your labors, which focuses, right? In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, your stranger who is within your gates. He has to give all of these specifics, and do you know why? Anybody want to take a guess? Why would he have to say, and let me explain, not you, not your servants, not your animals? Anybody know why he does that? Because we always look for loopholes. Please, let me look at the fine print. Let me see if we can find a workaround on this whole thing. Now, if you'll remember, by the time Jesus comes around, what they had turned it into was such a rigid, regimented thing that Jesus says, you will be so rigid that you don't want me to heal on the Sabbath. Yet, if it turns out that your son happens to be having his 8th-day birthday on the Sabbath, you will still circumcise him. So are you not breaking one of them? The point was they're rigid, but there's the point that you will be so worked up over one thing and yet you'll violate it in another because they had become servants of a day rather than have it be a day of their rest. It's not a work to do those things. So anyway, there is all of the controversy that comes up from this because we love loopholes. So he just says, look, don't you stay home but have everybody else work and think that you're getting around the whole thing. So he gives them all of the details. Now notice in verse 11, he says this and he puts it in there as a very interesting little thing, and it helps with that. Well, what were the days of creation? Were they really literal 24-hour days, or were they whatever? Well, look at what he says. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he hallowed it. Set it apart. So, yeah, there are lots of other reasons why, just from the original language in Genesis. It's obvious that he's talking about a 24-hour cycle, but because people have such a difficult time trying to, rival what they hear in science. I had somebody come up this morning and ask me, how do you deal with the dinosaurs and man? And so I said that, well, they were on the earth at the same time. We've got fossil records showing footprints alongside of what were clearly dinosaurs with humans. Besides, if as we're told to believe, that they were extinct 65 million years ago, 64 million years ago, every once in a while they will find a very well-preserved dinosaur. It's fascinating. And what they'll notice when they start to look at it, they'll see how well-preserved it is. And the most recent one I heard of was a Triceratops. Anybody want to doubt that that was a dinosaur? They found viable soft tissue in the bone. Now, viable soft tissue will not last more than about, at the best that they can guess, maybe 10,000 years. So that means that that animal had to have died within the last 10,000 years, but I'm told they're extinct for 65 million. Seems like God knows what he's doing. So here we have, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. Yeah, literal days. So he rested on the seventh. Therefore, he rested not because he was tired. He rested because everything was complete. There was to be a day of settling things, and he gave it as a pattern. So on that seventh day, we are to consecrate ourselves to him. Now, in verse 12 is where it becomes your interaction with other people. And here's the question that comes up from this one. Honor your mother and your father, or your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord has given to you. So the idea of honoring the father, yeah, there is an implied thing here, that your parents are honorable, right? That the things that they do are honorable. Now, what if your dad's head of the mafia? Well, not an honorable man in the things that he does. This is more dealing with assuming all of those things, but you are to give to them the place of recognition because of who they are. In the perfect place, remember, if people are living according to this and they're obedient to God, then the idea of a dishonorable parent doesn't really even exist. And the reason why is because they honor the Lord in all of these other things. They're the ones who are obedient to him as mother and father. So you look at them and their position, and you say, I honor them because of who they are. Because the day's going to come when it'll be me. And I would want my kids to honor me. But you, as parents, you be honorable so that your kids aren't put in that place of trying to pick and choose. So all of this is implied. It's pretty obvious when you look at it. But of course, if we don't take the time to be careful with it, we just go, well, what if the parents aren't honorable? Well, the parents are expected to be honorable. Notice we're talking about the Ten Commandments here. If they're obedient to those things, then they are worthy of that honor. So you kids, pay attention to your honorable parents and honor them, because your time's going to come. Use them as a pattern. So, the question of 13. I have heard this. Now, some of you may even have translations that says, you shall not kill. There are 3 common words in Hebrew that are used that could be kill. This is the one that is used when it is mentioning of murder. Because obviously God told them about what animals they could or could not eat. Now, did an animal not need to be first killed and then thoroughly drained of its blood in order to be, kosher and able to be eaten? Yes. So kill in the sense of generally saying killing is certainly not the issue. It is that you will not and this is directed towards people, it is the callous disregard and the murderous event that takes place. It's going to be elaborated on further in chapter 21, so we'll wait until we get there. But it's obvious from, first of all, context, that God would never contradict himself, so it's not about the idea of anything being put to death. It is the reason why. It is that murder, that anger, it's the homicide kind of a thing that's being mentioned. And he will elaborate further on that. Now he says also that you will not commit adultery. And none of these are difficult for us to understand. Adultery is pretty plain, pretty clear, easy for us to understand what that is. That is relationships with married people. So these are without comment. Remember, some of them he comments on. These ones don't need commentary. So he just says, this is what you will not do. You will not steal. Take that which belongs to someone else. And you will not bear false witness against your neighbor. Kind of interesting. You're not going to make an accusation against another person. That's the issue. Lying is a bad enough thing, but when it begins to have a direct, immediate effect on the person of whom you're saying it of, the easiest way for us to understand it is that we should never get in the place of lying about anything, let alone towards someone. That's just a different, even a higher degree. But you will not bear false witness against your neighbor, and you will not covet your neighbor's house. Now, when you hear house, you just think, okay, well, I don't want his, 4-bedroom, 2-bath, nice place in the other part of town. That's not what's being mentioned here. It's the idea of possessions. Now, how do I know that? Because, again, God has to elaborate on it. Look at what he ends up saying. You will not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, the covetous part of it is to say, I want and I'm willing to do what is necessary to get that. Coveting takes on a whole different thing. It's one thing to want something. It is another thing entirely when you begin to, because remember, if you're thinking about your neighbor's wife, that's going to cause the adultery. If you're going to be thinking about these other things, it leads to other stuff. Will I be willing to lie against them so that maybe I can bring charge against them and get what those things are? Notice the interrelation of these things. So your concern with these things is that you won't want the things that other people have. You can understand the wisdom of this. Why would you not want what someone else has? Because what are you willing to do? I just heard Naboth's name mentioned. So you can find example after example after example. The one that I was thinking when I was saying it is Bathsheba. So, David, what were you doing up on the roof? And people would say, well, what was Bathsheba doing up on the roof? I don't care. Look at what he had to do in order to get that. Look at what he had to do to get that. And think of the human cost of that. He had a man murdered and had other people complicit in the process to cover up his own sin. It's bad news. So one thing tends to lead to another. So the idea of coveting house, in this case, what we had mentioned just a few before was the adultery and the things that you want and you steal. This is all, notice how this is people who would be so consumed with self that they are willing to do any variety of thing that's just total wickedness. So he gives to him these things. And here are what we would consider as the 10 Commandments. Now, these and all of the other ones will be codified, meaning that they'll be put into text. And they will be written in books that people will be able to understand. And again, we have that record here in front of us of what those things are. But let's remember the transition that has now happened in how God interacts with his creation and with the children of Israel. To this point, they knew that God expected things of them, but they walked with him by faith because there wasn't anything in writing of do this and don't do that. This is a change in the way that God is interacting with his people because now it is going to be this is expected of you. So do this and don't do that. If you do this and I don't want you to do it, there will be consequences. And he spells those things out. Now, we know that that is a frustrating thing. If you've ever studied through the law, you'd have to ask yourself, who on earth could ever keep this? And it helps us to understand why Paul says what he says to the Galatians, that the law, the things that we're reading here, are intended to bring us to Jesus. These are the things that instruct us as a master or as a taskmaster or as a schoolmaster that brings us to the Lord where we ultimately say, I know that this is God's intent, but I am totally incapable of living up to it. I can't do these things. Now, that's not a cop-out. It's just a statement of fact. And if that brings us to Jesus, then what does that mean? I come to him with my failure and say, I can't do this. So I come to him. Why him? Well, because he did keep all of those things perfectly. And it's his perfection that was traded for my imperfection. So his sinless life was given for my sinful one. And the law was to help us to understand if those people might think, well, I'm not a sinner. Well, sure you are, because if you want to know what God's perfect standard is, here you have it. Try to tell me that you could live up to this. You can't. For those that would reject Jesus, you know that this is going to be what judges them, what we're reading here. They will ultimately find out that God has a law that they have absolutely miserably failed. And yet God says, I expect this. Yeah, was he writing to the nation? Absolutely. But he has also told the nation that he is holy and that he is the God of all creation. So this is what it would take to walk honorably before God and to be perfect in his sight. No one measures up. So to the believer we say, I don't measure up. Great. God knows that. It was put in writing so that we would have no excuse, bringing us to Jesus and crying out for mercy. God, forgive me and save me. I am a sinner and I need your forgiveness. What the law would end up doing. And we will study as we go through this, their way of trying to get that reconciled with God was sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, over and over and over again. Book of Hebrews, right? All of those things were in place. They were what God had expected to be done. However, in the person of Jesus, all of that is done away with, the necessity for it. All of that fell upon him. But it is not something, like I said at the beginning, just because he has shown us grace, we are never to forget his holiness. Now, he'll explain a little bit of that in the latter part of this chapter. And then really go into it full tilt, starting in chapter 21. And he starts to put in a lot of the detail. Right now, he's given us big snapshots, 10 of them. And so he says it says in verse 18, here's the reaction. Now, they had seen this, the thundering. God, remember in the last chapter, had given very specific details. When I come to the mountain, make sure that the people know that they can come this far but no further. And if they overstep that and try to go past it, they'll die on the spot. They'll be put, well, they won't die on the spot. They'll be put to death, and it's going to be through these means. Here is how it's going to happen. But they will be put to death for their disobedience. So that's all been done. They've seen this, and they've heard the thunderings, and they were already in a place of fearfulness. Moses goes up, hears from the Lord, and he's coming back down, and here's what happens with the people. Now, verse 18, all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Now, if this was us today, now we know the Lord, right? We're here in church, we're saved, we're all the rest of that stuff. But I just have to ask you, if you just decided to take a trip to that part of the world and you came to, let's say, Sinai, and this happened again, what would your reaction be? Oh, cool. I remember reading about this in Exodus. Let's go see what's happening up there. You'd probably do the same thing that these guys did. Let's stand back a little ways from this and just see what happens. Well, this was their reaction. And it's a good thing that they recognize the holiness of God, because by this time he has already communicated to them. I have things that I want to say. Moses will be the one that I will communicate with, and he will talk to you. Now, as they see this, Moses hasn't yet even come back to them. God's given the instruction, the first 10 of them. There will be many to follow. But the people see what's going on the mountain, and it caused a fearfulness in them and a trembling. Now, I want to make sure I point this out too. Whenever we talk about the fear of the Lord, actually the book of Proverbs and other places talks about the fear of the Lord, that it's the beginning of wisdom. It will cause you, if you have a reverence and an awe and a respect, these people had all of those things. There was also that real awesome understanding because they're seeing it with their own eyes. Look at what God does when he just shows up. The whole mountain is enveloped. Smoke and lightning and, oh my gosh, your eyes, the sensory things. It's a pretty impressive thing to see. So yeah, it's going to kind of make you buckle at the knees a little bit. But it is also a recognition that this same God who speaks is beyond our understanding to measure. In the visual sense, in the sensory way. So they stood afar off. Don't get close. I have a feeling these people were told, there's this line. Don't cross it. If you know that would end up wiping you out, would you ever go all the way up to the tip of that line? No. I know it's over there somewhere. I'll just stand back, just so it doesn't quite happen, right? They're kind of doing that same thing. Verse 19. So then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. Yeah, they get the picture. Now, there are two ways to look at this. Is this because they are being really careful to the instruction that God had given to them? He's not communicating directly to them. He has already told them through him that he's going to communicate with Moses and that Moses would be that person. Is this a recognition that they see that and say, we're not going to try to overstep. We'll do exactly as God has said. Moses, you speak to him, and then you come back and you speak to us. We won't try to do it. We don't want to die in the process. So whether it was they were just overwhelmed by what they saw and thought that it would mean a death sentence to them, or whether they just paid attention to what was said to them. This is what they were supposed to do. So verse 20 tells us, so then Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. This is why. He wants you to be in a place. Look, God does not put things in place as a way to trip us up. He gives us the exact do's and don'ts so that we can walk in a place of fellowship with him. Look, remember what happened, I think it was 1 Samuel 15, when Saul was told of how his dealings with the Amalekites was supposed to go. Samuel comes out to see him, and he didn't follow the way that he was supposed to, and so he blames the people for parts of it. He takes some of it himself and said, we wanted to offer the best of the things to God. And Samuel said, but that's not what God asked for. Don't you know that God really desires obedience over sacrifice? So if we fully understand that, it's like God says, okay, I've given the whole sacrificial system so that you can get yourself reconciled before me. Wouldn't it be better if you didn't have to be reconciled, if you were just obedient in the first place? So to the believer, there's nothing worse for us than to come before God and say, I've sinned against you and I've fallen short. I'm thankful for forgiveness and I'm thankful for your grace, Lord. I'm thankful for all those things, but I don't want to have to come before you ashamed for my actions. Every one of us has been in that place. Wouldn't it be better not to have to get there in the first place? There's a lot more comfort in that, because you don't have to come hat in your hand and just saying, why, after all of what I know, did I still do the things that I do? We've all been there, but we recognize that it doesn't have to be so. Well, this was all put in place so that they would understand. So they had said, Moses told the people, these things were put there that you may have a reverence for him, that you would fear him, and that reverence and fear would keep you from falling into a position or a place of sin. That's a pretty straightforward statement. We certainly understand it in principle. In practice is where it gets dicey for the human, right? We understand God has his standards, and we find out how easy it is for us to overstep those. Well, in verse 21 we hear, so the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, thus you will say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me or alongside me. This is a commentary again about that you will have no gods before me. It doesn't mean that he's willing to share the stage if you just make him in that first place of priority. He elaborates further on it here in verse 23 by you will not make anything to be with me or alongside me. Whether they're gods of silver or they're gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves. So this doesn't mean, well, he didn't mention wood or stone. Okay. Right. Small details, right? His reason for pointing out silver and gold is those were precious more than stone or wood. So if you're not going to make it out of gold or silver, these precious things, then you should also realize that it extends down to whatever else you could make it out of. And I don't care if it's made out of plaster of Paris. Don't do it. And it goes right along with the second of his commandments. Don't make a carved image. Don't make something that resembles something else and worship it, bow down to it, or even serve it. Just don't do those things. And this is a further elaboration on this. Now, he gives a little bit more clarification. In verse 24, he says, an altar of earth you will make for me. Now, this is wherever they may go. This is going to stand in place for the rest of time. So when they approach him and when they come to him, remember this is a kind of an altar. This is the first time that he's given real specific instructions. And he'll give a lot more of it because he's going to start giving them the implements of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and all of those things. It's going to go into vivid detail of what they're supposed to have. But he begins this idea of the altar. So it says, "An altar of earth you will make for me, and you will sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you." So where I determine those places of my choosing, when you get there, you'll make an earthen altar. He's going to give some more specifics about it, but notice, even in this, the amount of detail. And again, as we go on through this study, he's going to elaborate further on these. Right now he's putting in place very big, firm structures, but the little nuances of it will still be added in as time goes by. So, in verse 25 and 26, a couple of other things that he throws in. Remember this earthen thing. Now, this could be mud or whatever else. If it's going to be something that you make, let's say, out of stone, which means that he's okay with that too. If it's not going to be something made out of mud or earthen things, clay or whatever, if you're going to do it out of stone, even this has a way of doing it that's acceptable to him. Verse 25. "And if you will make me an altar of stone, you will not build it of hewn stone. For if you use your tool on it, you've profaned it." Now, there are some people that would look at that and say, well, why is that? Best way that we can understand is that it would go along with the idea of fashioning things for your kind of worship. There are those that would speculate why he says it in particular here. When people begin to make it out of stone, there's a labor to it, and people tend to make and fashion things in their carving or in their way of putting it together. God here just says, if you're going to build it out of stones, grab the ones that are there, build them one on top of another, but don't labor, don't put a tool to it, don't make it, don't fashion it, make it of what is available, of what is natural. Now the last part of this, which is very interesting too, the modesty issue becomes an issue here too. Now, if you can imagine that everything was going to be at ground level, and there's a reason for it. He says it right here in verse 26. "Nor will you go up by steps to the altar." Now why is that? "That your nakedness may not be exposed on it." So even that idea of just absolute modesty was an issue as well. Remember, most of these guys were wearing robes and everything else. But God did not want anything of them to be seen by the people because of the distraction that would come from it. So, again, this is where I'd love to point back to the idea of holiness. God has standards, and those standards are, we might think, rigid, but there's a reason why. And notice that the thing here is not because of the priests, but it's the people who would be seeing. If you guys are walking up to the altar and people are able to see you, it would be a stumbling thing to everyone else. That's the issue here. And we find that's complete all the way through the New Testament. The idea of any of our conduct being stumbling to somebody, whether it's eating meat, whether it's doing this, that, or the other thing, it's always the same issue. All the way back here at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. Here's how you're to make your altars. Your altars, if you're going to make them out of earthen things, fine. If you're going to make them out of stones, make sure that you didn't labor to make them the way that they are. Take what's there naturally. When you do the things like this, that you're not going to use the tool on it, also when you go to the Lord and you go to serve him, make sure that there's nothing of your, quote, nakedness that can be seen because it stumbles the other people. So all the way back to there, he's making an issue of this. So why I've left chapter 21, even in the 15 minutes that we have left, there's just no way to deal with even the opening parts of it, but we'll read the first few verses. Chapter 21 begins by saying, "Now these are the judgments which you will set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he will serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year he will go free and pay nothing." We're going to get into what is a servant. There's a really interesting way that we understand it even in the New Testament sense, and there's a real progression from the Old Testament to the New Testament sense. We'll go through what that is. But notice even in the first verse, for those people that say, well, the Bible condones slavery. Well, slavery like we think of in the early parts of our nation didn't have a situation like this where it's, okay, they're going to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th you've got to let them go. There was no such thing like that. And you'll notice that they have rights and privileges and everything else, and there's a reason why that they were in a place of servitude. We'll get into all of that and explain it in detail. There's just no way to do it quickly, because it really keeps going on for quite a bit. You'll notice at verse 12, it's going to elaborate a little bit more on the idea of you will not murder. Verse 12 tells us, he who strikes a man so that he dies will surely be put to death himself. Capital punishment. We're going to get into all of that kind of stuff. So I don't want to rush my way through this. So what we'll do is we'll end early tonight, and we'll leave chapter 21 for its own. As in closing in this, let me just again restate that we are so often able to miss the idea of God's absolute holiness and perfection simply because we are not under the constraints of all of the law. But that is certainly not an excuse for, as Paul would talk about, it's not a cloak of lasciviousness. That's just fancy words, meaning we can't say just because we have grace, God doesn't expect a conduct out of us that's becoming. So if anything, that's argued against entirely. Paul would tell you, I don't want to give offense to anyone in any kind of a thing. So whatever it is that I may do that's offensive, I won't do it for the sake of their conscience. That's a pretty impressive thing. So easy to say, not as always as easy to do, right? So as we study through this a little bit further, you'll see really interesting commentary that is given and elaboration that's given on these first 10. By the time that we're done studying through all of the books of the law, there are ultimately, as they counted them up and all of the little sub things, there are hundreds of things in the law that people were expected to do and to know and to be obedient to, all of which would get you to the place of saying, I can't do this, to where God would say, I know you can, and it cost my son his life, so take the grace that you've been given. Amen? All right, so let's stand, and we'll have them close us, and we'll be ending a little bit early. I'll go down and warn the people in children's ministry, but I don't want to, again, rush into chapter 21. Let's stand and let's have a closing word of prayer. Father, as we come before you once again, we want to thank you that you have given to us this incredible measure of holiness. You have not changed. You are the same God today, forever, yesterday, today, and forever. And so as we study through these chapters, we pray, God, that we wouldn't look at them as though they've passed by and that you've somehow become different. You are still as perfect as you ever were. And Lord, may we be obedient to you that we wouldn't bring offense. We do thank you that in those times of our waywardness and of our offense, though, you are there to forgive and to cleanse. We pray that we would avail ourselves of that mercy and grace that you've given to us. So we thank you for your word again. We thank you for how the word instructs us as it does. And we ask that we would be careful to walk with you in a place of integrity. We thank you. We give you praise in Jesus' name.